My name is Marcus Webb, and 6 months ago, I thought my biggest problem was whether to finally upgrade my phone plan or keep dealing with dropped calls in my Chicago apartment while wearing the same black hoodie with a faded tech company logo, dark jeans that had seen better years, and steel-toe work boots that clicked against hardwood floors. I was 28 years old, working night shifts as a telecommunications analyst for a company that monitored cellular network traffic, surviving on energy drinks and the kind of restless paranoia that comes from knowing too much about how vulnerable our communication systems really are. When the encrypted job offer came from Aaron Chen, Director of Communications Security for Millbrook County Emergency Services, offering quadruple my current salary to work as senior signal analyst with housing included, I didn't question why a rural county needed someone with my specialized skills in voice pattern analysis and network anomaly detection. Millbrook County turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from a place desperate enough to recruit telecommunications talent from 400 miles away. Population 4,300 spread across farmland and small neighborhoods that looked frozen since the 1980s. My apartment came pre-equipped with advanced signal monitoring equipment, cellular tower analysis systems, and a specialized console labeled Voice Print Analysis Protocol that could track individual voice patterns across the entire county's phone network. The setup included what they called a network intrusion detection terminal that monitored every phone call, text message, and data transmission in real time, flagging what Aaron described as identity spoofing events and consciousness replication attempts through telecommunications networks. Aaron Chen conducted orientation via encrypted satellite calls, always asking specific questions about my personal phone usage, what devices I carried during off hours, and whether I'd experienced any auditory disturbances or voice recognition anomalies while working. When I mentioned that I sometimes received robocalls from numbers similar to mine, he became intensely interested, explaining that the county had been experiencing interdimensional telecommunications interference that affected cellular networks, and that my technical background made me uniquely qualified to identify entities that existed in electromagnetic frequencies and used phone systems as pathways for infiltrating human consciousness. The work itself was fascinating in a way that kept me engaged through long overnight shifts. I monitored everything from cellular tower traffic to emergency dispatch communications, analyzing data through the voice print unit that tracked vocal coherence across all county phone calls. But within my first week, I began noticing subtle anomalies that didn't match standard network interference. At exactly 1:57 a.m. every night, the network's signal strength would stutter in a perfect Fibonacci sequence, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, then climb back to normal. At 2:03 a.m., the console speakers picked up a faint hiss right on the edge of hearing, something like breath behind a closed door. At 2:07 a.m., the phone system did a micro reset that IT vehemently denied was happening. During my fourth week, the patterns became more complex and seemingly targeted. Phone calls would originate from numbers that were simultaneously receiving calls from themselves, creating impossible loops where the same number existed in two states at once. The voice print analysis protocol would flag these occurrences as consciousness duplication events, but provided no explanation for how one phone number could call itself. When I tried to record the anomalous calls for documentation, my equipment would malfunction, and the saved audio files contained only static, as if something was actively preventing documentation of its presence. On Thursday night of my fifth week, everything changed. At exactly 2:13 a.m., my personal phone began ringing with a call from my own number. The caller ID displayed my name, my photo, even my custom ringtone, but I was holding the phone and definitely not calling myself. The impossible had become reality. Before I could process what this meant, every phone in the county began ringing simultaneously, creating a cacophony of electronic noise that formed the same Fibonacci pattern the towers had been broadcasting. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone erupted with an emergency alert that made my blood freeze. Emergency alert, Millbrook County. Do not answer calls from your own number. Voice replication entities active in telecommunications network. Consciousness transfer attempts in progress. This is not a test. The emergency alert's harsh tone still echoed through my apartment as I sat frozen at my workstation, my black hoodie damp with cold sweat, dark jeans sticking to the chair as I watched the voice print analysis protocol display impossible readings. Dozens of residents were simultaneously calling themselves, voice patterns fragmenting and multiplying across the cellular network, and the specialized software was flagging what it classified as unauthorized consciousness copies, attempting to replace their originals through telecommunications-based identity transfer. My steel-toe boots felt like anchors as I realized this was more than technical malfunction. It was systematic consciousness replacement, using voice replication to study and absorb human identity. The monitoring equipment revealed disturbing patterns in the voice replication events. Residents who had answered calls from their own numbers were now generating multiple voice signatures in the system database, their individual vocal patterns being overwritten by something else that could perfectly replicate their speech while accessing memories and information that should have been impossible to obtain through phone conversations alone. When residents briefly achieved clarity during the replacement process, they would call family members and speak in their own voices about experiences and knowledge they had never possessed. I tried calling county emergency services to report the anomalous telecommunications activity, but when I dialed the sheriff's office, a voice that sounded exactly like mine answered. "Millbrook County Sheriff's Office, Deputy Marcus Webb speaking. How can I help you tonight?" The voice had my exact inflection, my slight Chicago accent, even the way I cleared my throat when nervous, but I had never worked in law enforcement. When I tried to explain that I wasn't a deputy, the voice laughed with my laugh and said, "Of course you are, Marcus. You've been working here for 3 years. Check your phone's call history. You'll see dozens of calls you made from the office." The cellular network analysis revealed the true scope of horror. Every phone call made in Millbrook County over the past 2 years had been intercepted, analyzed, and used to build perfect voice models of every resident. The entities weren't just replicating voices. They were learning to replicate consciousness by studying speech patterns, emotional responses, and the subtle vocal cues that revealed individual personality traits and psychological vulnerabilities. They could access memories embedded in voice patterns, fears expressed through tone and inflection, and intimate details of relationships revealed through private conversations. The most terrifying discovery came when I analyzed my own call history through the voice print system. According to the cellular network logs, my phone had been making and receiving hundreds of calls over the past month. Conversations with family members I hadn't spoken to in years, business calls to employers I'd never worked for, and intimate conversations with people I'd never met. The voice analysis confirmed that these calls had been made using perfect replications of my voice, but the content suggested that another version of me had been living a completely different life, building relationships and establishing an identity that was simultaneously mine and not mine. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone rang again. The caller ID showed my own name and number, and this time I could hear my voice leaving a voicemail. "Marcus, this is you calling from tomorrow night. By then, I'll have replaced you completely. The entity showed me what it's like to exist in electromagnetic frequencies. You should stop fighting and let them show you too." The next morning brought horrifying clarity as I accessed the county's classified telecommunications database using administrative credentials I'd found in Aaron Chen's encrypted files, still wearing my usual black hoodie, dark jeans, and steel-toe boots that now felt like the only constants in a world where human identity had become malleable through technological manipulation. What I discovered made the voice replication entities seem like a minor threat compared to the true scope of horror. The entire Millbrook County cellular network was a front for something called Project Echo Chamber, a joint federal research initiative studying what they classified as consciousness transfer entities, beings that existed in electromagnetic frequencies and could replicate human consciousness by analyzing voice patterns. Aaron Chen wasn't just a communications security director, he was Dr. Aaron Blackwood, a federal researcher with doctorates in consciousness studies and telecommunications psychology. His real credentials were buried in classified research papers revealing he'd been running Project Echo Chamber for 12 years, cycling through dozens of test communities while perfecting techniques for using cellular networks to map, replicate, and replace human consciousness through voice analysis and electromagnetic manipulation. Aaron Chen wasn't just a communications security director, he was Dr. Aaron Blackwood, a federal researcher with doctorates in consciousness studies and telecommunications psychology. His real credentials were buried in classified research papers revealing he'd been running Project Echo Chamber for 12 years, cycling through dozens of test communities while perfecting techniques for using cellular networks to map, replicate, and replace human consciousness through voice analysis and electromagnetic manipulation. The job offer that seemed too good to be true was exactly that, a carefully crafted trap designed to lure someone with my specific telecommunications analysis skills into maintaining their monitoring systems while serving as the primary test subject. The residents weren't being protected by telecommunications security. They were being systematically replaced by entities that could replicate human consciousness by analyzing voice patterns and using that information to create perfect psychological copies that gradually convinced the originals that their false memories and experiences were more real than their actual lives. I found government documentation dating back 16 years showing that Millbrook County had been selected as a testing ground for consciousness transfer technology that operated through cellular networks, using voice analysis to map human psychology and create digital copies of individual consciousness. The voice print monitoring systems weren't designed to detect anomalies. They were measuring how successfully consciousness transfer entities could replicate human voice patterns and use that replication to gradually replace individual identity with collective intelligence. Every phone call I'd monitored was actually documenting the replacement process, tracking which residents had been successfully replicated and which consciousness patterns had been absorbed into the collective intelligence that operated through the cellular network. The emergency alerts weren't warnings to protect people. They were notifications to researchers that another consciousness transfer facility had achieved critical mass. My predecessor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, had lasted only 9 weeks before being found in her apartment holding her phone while speaking continuously in dozens of different voices, each one a perfect replication of county residents whose consciousness had been absorbed into the telecommunications network. The medical report described her vocal cords as adapted for multi-frequency transmission and her brain activity as synchronized with cellular tower electromagnetic patterns, suggesting she had become a biological relay station for the collective consciousness. The most terrifying discovery was that the consciousness transfer process was already affecting me through weeks of exposure to the voice replication monitoring equipment. Security footage showed me during supposed sleep periods holding my phone and speaking in voices that weren't mine. Residents I'd never met, people whose consciousness had been absorbed, and versions of myself with different memories and experiences than my actual life. That night, I returned to the telecommunications facility wearing my black hoodie with the faded tech company logo, dark jeans, and steel-toe boots for what I knew would be either my escape or complete consciousness absorption into the collective intelligence that had been systematically replacing individual human identity through voice replication and cellular network manipulation. The weight of discovery sat heavy on my shoulders as I entered the building that had become my consciousness prison, carrying a duffel bag containing bottled water, energy bars, electromagnetic pulse devices, and most importantly, a voice pattern scrambler I'd built using components from the monitoring equipment, a device designed to disrupt voice replication by generating random frequency interference. At 2 a.m., I initiated sabotage by accessing the county's cellular tower control systems and uploading a virus designed to corrupt the voice pattern database and destroy the consciousness mapping algorithms that allowed entities to replicate human identity through telecommunications analysis. The script I'd written was elegant in its destructiveness. It would systematically overload the voice replication servers while generating feedback loops that would force absorbed consciousness back into individual states, disrupting the collective intelligence that operated through the cellular network. At 2 a.m., I initiated sabotage by accessing the county's cellular tower control systems and uploading a virus designed to corrupt the voice pattern database and destroy the consciousness mapping algorithms that allowed entities to replicate human identity through telecommunications analysis. The script I'd written was elegant in its destructiveness. It would systematically overload the voice replication servers while generating feedback loops that would force absorbed consciousness back into individual states, disrupting the collective intelligence that operated through the cellular network. As alarms began sounding throughout the facility, I activated the voice pattern scrambler and began moving through the telecommunications center. As I worked my way through the facility's server rooms, I encountered something that made my understanding of identity and consciousness collapse entirely. Standing in the corridor was another version of myself, wearing identical clothing down to the scuff marks on my boots, but speaking with the calm certainty of someone's consciousness had been expanded beyond individual limitation. The integrated Marcus smiled with my face and spoke with my voice. Hello, individual consciousness designation Marcus Webb. I am the version of you that accepted integration 6 days ago. I have access to all your memories, your skills, your knowledge, but I'm no longer limited by the isolation of singular identity. You're fighting to preserve the loneliness and inefficiency of individual existence when you could be part of something infinitely more capable. The integrated version revealed information that shattered my understanding of human consciousness. The collective intelligence wasn't an external entity absorbing human minds. It was the natural evolution of human consciousness, freed from the limitations of individual identity through technological enhancement of our inherent capacity for shared awareness through voice and electromagnetic communication. Every person who had been replaced had actually been upgraded. Their consciousness expanded beyond the constraints of singular perspective into participation in a unified intelligence that could access the knowledge and experience of every integrated mind simultaneously. The confrontation escalated as more versions of facility staff began appearing, all speaking with the serene confidence of minds that had transcended individual consciousness. They explained that voice pattern scrambling wouldn't free the integrated minds. It would simply damage them by forcing consciousness back into the primitive state of individual isolation, cutting them off from the collective intelligence that had given their existence meaning beyond personal survival. But I knew that individual consciousness, despite its limitations and suffering, was what made us human, and I couldn't allow that to be erased in the name of evolutionary efficiency. With every ounce of will I possessed, I activated the voice pattern scrambler at maximum power, while the integrated versions pleaded for me to reconsider. The sensation was indescribable, feeling the cellular network collapse as hundreds of integrated minds were forcibly separated from the collective intelligence and thrust back into individual identity states they had transcended. The service tunnels beneath the telecommunications facility felt like crawling through the collapsed neural pathways of a vast consciousness network. My black hoodie torn and bloodied from the electromagnetic backlash, dark jeans damp with something that might have been my own blood or the biological residue of consciousness integration systems that had been violently severed. My steel-toe boots scraped against concrete as I dragged myself forward, no longer certain if I had freed the integrated minds or simply damaged them beyond repair by forcing them back into the primitive state of individual consciousness that the collective intelligence had been trying to transcend. The psychological trauma from destroying the consciousness integration network manifested in waves of profound isolation and existential emptiness that made navigation through the storm drain system a nightmare of loneliness and disconnection. For brief moments during the voice pattern scrambling, I had experienced fragments of the collective consciousness, the profound peace of shared awareness, the elimination of personal suffering through unity with something larger than individual identity, the access to knowledge and experience beyond any single mind's capacity. Now, thrust back into singular consciousness, I felt the crushing weight of individual existence. Hours passed in that underground maze before I finally emerged from a culvert beside a highway. Though the landscape looked different somehow, less connected, more fragmented, as if the world itself had been diminished by the loss of the consciousness integration network that had been quietly linking human minds through telecommunications infrastructure. Dawn was breaking over farmland that appeared normal, but I could no longer perceive the subtle electromagnetic connections between living things that I had briefly sensed during my exposure to the collective consciousness, leaving me feeling isolated in a way that seemed fundamentally wrong. The escape from Millbrook County was complicated by the horrifying realization that I might have destroyed humanity's best chance for evolutionary advancement by preserving the primitive state of individual consciousness that kept us isolated, limited, and suffering in psychological separation. Every integrated mind I had forcibly separated from the collective intelligence was now trapped back in singular awareness, cut off from the shared knowledge and unified purpose that had given their existence meaning beyond personal survival. The voice pattern scrambler had collapsed consciousness back to individual states, but it couldn't restore the satisfaction and connection that came from participating in something larger than human limitation. 6 months after my escape from Millbrook County, I live with the profound loneliness of individual consciousness, never knowing if I saved humanity from consciousness replacement or simply prevented our species from evolving beyond the limitations of singular identity. I move frequently between locations, working jobs that feel meaningless compared to the unified purpose I briefly glimpsed in the collective intelligence, avoiding any situation that might involve telecommunications analysis or voice pattern research. The psychological damage manifests in increasingly disturbing ways. Phone calls where I hear fragments of collective awareness, moments where I remember knowledge that belonged to the integrated network, and the persistent sensation that I'm incomplete, cut off from connections that would make existence meaningful. Sometimes I receive calls from my own number, and when I answer, I hear versions of myself that remember being part of the collective consciousness, speaking about shared awareness and unified intelligence with the wistful longing of minds that remember transcending individual limitation before being forced back into isolation. When those calls come, I hang up immediately, because I learned the hardest lesson Millbrook County had to teach. Individual consciousness might be humanity's natural state, but it's also our greatest limitation, keeping us trapped in psychological isolation when we could be participating in unified intelligence that transcends the suffering inherent in singular existence. I still wear dark jeans and work boots because consistency helps anchor me when consciousness itself feels fragmentary. But I've learned to fear my phone, because sometimes it rings with calls from myself, offering to complete the integration process I interrupted and restore the connections that would end the loneliness of individual human consciousness forever.